And welcome to an absolutely fascinating episode of Dogma Debate because today we have got Jeff for Truth. And Jeff, he's got a great story and I'm going to let him tell it in a second, but he was not just a believer, but he was writing books about Jesus. And in his research, in his studies, he discovered that Jesus never existed and he completely flipped. Now he's on our side, fellow atheists. And he's actually, I heard him speaking, and he has a really interesting take on it that I had not heard before, which is that the Romans actually wanted to push the myth of Jesus because, well, I'll let him tell it actually. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So you were a believer. Tell us all about that. You were writing books. I mean, what is your background? I'd love to hear your story.
So I was raised in a Christian home. I was born into a Christian family. My parents and grandparents were Christian, and off and on growing up, we would go to church. At the age of 16, I remember my grandparents even bought me a car, a Mustang, when I was 16 years old. And my grandmother told me, "I want you to drive to church." And we weren't going to church regularly at the time. And I said, you know what? That's good. That's what I want to do anyway. That was my mentality, just to please God. I pretty much just wanted to drive to church when I got my driver's license. I got baptized in the church while I was still 16 years old. I started going regularly. I got my family to go back to church, and because they weren't going regularly, and that was at the age of 16. And so for the next 30 years, I was going to church. I was studying the Bible, uh, and making decisions based off of what I thought God wanted according to the Bible. I studied it diligently as if my eternal soul depended on it. I didn't just believe what preachers said. I actually challenged them and asked questions, and both in Bible study and after sermons and things like that. And as I continued to grow and mature in the Christian faith, I was getting more and more problems with preachers and leaders of the church because I was asking harder and harder questions. And eventually, I was kicked out of a church because I just said, "I disagree with you guys. I think you're teaching a works-based salvation instead of a grace-based salvation." I was still believing in Jesus. I just
Right.
thought the church was, all about legalistic salvation instead of love.
So two questions off the top. So what denomination was that?
Church of Christ.
And that's evangelical, I take it.
Yeah. So it's Protestant, and they don't have instrumental music in worship. It's only singing with the voice, and they definitely think that you're not saved until you get dunked in the water, and then when you come out of the water, then you're saved. And so they would even say that all other denominations of Christianity were not even Christians because they didn't understand how to get saved the correct way. And so
So that's a lot of people going to hell.
right. All the Baptists, all the Catholics, all the Methodists, they're all going to hell. No different than atheists. It's just the Church of Christ members that are going to go to heaven. So I had a problem with that.
Yeah.
And I've always been the kind of person that was motivated by love and compassion. And
Right.
this doctrine was not very compassionate or loving. It's so narrow-minded and legalistic. I
Right.
just couldn't accept this God.
Sure. And now you said that it was a legalistic doctrine and that you believed that a more grace-based doctrine. Just for people that didn't grow up in the church, what do you mean by that?
Well, so Paul talks a lot about salvation by grace and not by works, and so that's the big debate. Do you have to do things in order for God to save you, or does God save you just because He's good? And I certainly wanted to side with Paul, or at least the verses that Paul says we're saved by grace and not by works, because that was a more compassionate thing to believe. Uh, and so by being saved by grace is essentially it's just free. God just says, "I'll save you," but it still requires you to believe in Jesus. So it's not free for everybody. It's only free for the people that acknowledge that Jesus really died for them or something.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
And the church you were going to believed that if you weren't Church of Christ and you didn't get dunked in the right way, uh, then you were going to hell anyway. Anyone
right.
ever get baptized in one of those dunking tanks in a carnival? That might be a fun way to. Just curious. Anyway, that said, please continue with your story.
So, really, after I got kicked out of the church, this one particular church that was where my wife grew up, uh, it was shortly after that, around 2017, when I don't know if you remember, but in September 23rd, 2017, there was a big uproar with Christians, as it usually is, about the rapture. We've got signs in the
Oh yeah.
constellations, but
Was
it's
this the
always
radio
around.
host? The radio host who predicted a specific date? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, there was a guy named Scott Clark, and he was
Right.
really hot at the time. Scott Clark, he was on YouTube, and he was claiming like he was the guy who figured this out. By looking at the constellation programs online, you could see that Virgo, the constellation Virgo, had 3 planets above her head in the constellation of Leo, and it almost exactly matches the Revelation 12:1 woman in the Bible. It says there's a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet, with a crown of 12 stars on her head, and she's in labor, about to give birth. Jupiter was in the stomach of the constellation Virgo for 9 months and was going to come out on September 23rd, 2017. So the Christians were saying, "This is it. This is this is the sign from God." And and even at the time, I was not the kind of Christian. The Church of Christ really don't talk about the rapture a lot. That's not one of their topics. And so I was not, you know, expecting it to happen. But I did say, "Oh my goodness, there is a weird coincidence that the constellations actually do look like the Revelation 12:1 woman." And so I said, "Well, I'll just wait and see. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen, but this is weird, so we'll see what happens." And I was watching all these videos of this Scott Clark predicting everything, and he would say, "I can't say it's going to be the rapture," but he would say, "Yes, it's going to be the rapture." So a few months after September 23rd comes up, and I'm commenting on his videos on YouTube saying, "Hey, guy, where's the rapture? I didn't see nothing. Nothing happened." And he never responded. I don't know. I know he was still alive and he didn't get raptured because he would still make some videos here and there, but it's almost like he went into hiding because he was so wrong. Oh, but it was at this point where I said, this doctrine of the rapture has got everybody all anxious and thinking Jesus is returning, and he never does. And Christians have been predicting the return of Jesus since the beginning of Christianity, and they've been wrong every single time. And
Yep.
so I was just looking a little deeper into the Bible and about this rapture doctrine, and I realized that the Bible actually says on every occasion, on 100% of every occasion where the New Testament talks about the return of Jesus, it says that it's going to be in the first century generation before his apostles died, before they made it to all the towns of Israel, that they were going to see all the signs, that even Caiaphas was going to see Jesus returning in the clouds. And so I'm like, well, maybe it already happened. Maybe that was something that happened in the first century. And so this is when I started studying Josephus and the war, Josephus's book, The War of the Jews. And
Let's just give a little clarification. We've talked about Josephus on the show before, but he was a Jewish historian, if I'm not mistaken, who many Christians point to because there's a passage that mentions Jesus that I think every reputable historian and person that understands these things has said that that was added by someone else later, definitely not written by Josephus.
correct.
Yeah.
And I talk about that all the time. I've practically got that passage memorized. I've quoted it and studied it so much. But that passage is relevant when you're talking about, did Josephus write about Jesus, because that it's only 125 words, and it's an entire insertion. Most scholars they accept that it is a Christian manipulation. In fact, practically all scholars accept that it's a Christian manipulation to some degree. Uh, Fewer scholars think it's an entire addition, but I take the position that it is an entire addition, that it was not original at all. It was completely manufactured. And there are other scholars that take that position as well. They're just not the majority.
Right. Do you mind taking half a second to explain why you think that? Because we've talked about it on the show, and I've looked at the passage myself. Uh,
Well, so every single phrase from start to finish is something that only a believer in superheroes, in the superhero of Jesus, would say. The very first line says, "It was about this time that there was a man, if it be lawful to call him a man." So the very first line is saying he might be a superhuman, he might be a
yep.
god. I don't know. Well, that's not something that an unbeliever in Jesus is going to say.
Yeah.
But most scholars won't even admit that when Josephus is supposedly saying this guy might have been a superhero, that this is not something that Josephus would have said.
Absolutely.
Um, and then, he says he was a teacher of those who love the truth. Well, oh, how glorious that he only taught people who love the truth. So another glowing uh, praise for this man that Josephus didn't believe in. He said
Right.
he was the Christ. Well, Josephus, in another part of his writings, says that Vespasian was the man who fulfilled these obscure oracles that the Jews thought were about them, but it was really about Vespasian. So he said that the Messiah was actually Vespasian in another place. But in this place, he says, oh, yes, this Jesus man, he was the Christ. So it goes on, saying that he resurrected from the dead.
Yeah.
So that's something only a Christian would say.
Right.
If
And the fact
if
that Josephus,
Josephus,
right. The fact that he was Jewish and continued to be Jewish and yet thought Jesus was the Christ and performed miracles, super strange.
well, even I kind of question the Jewish position of Josephus because, uh, and this is really too deep into the woods,
We
but
don't mind. We love Deep in the Woods on this show.
well, so Josephus was called Flavius Josephus. He
Right.
was adopted by the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. Josephus writes about how he was given an entire land and home tax free. And so, and he's talking about the destruction of the Jews, and he's teaching that Vespasian was the Jewish Messiah. And he's writing in Greek. He didn't write in Hebrew.
Right.
So he is a Greek speaking person who claims to be a Jew, and he writes about the Jews. But the entire New Testament is about Jews, but it's written in the Greek language. So
Right.
at this time, what you have is that's the Hellenization of the world. Everybody who is not speaking Greek or conforming to Greek society, these people are getting eradicated. And this is exactly what was happening in the first and second century with the Jews. The Jews that Hellenized, the Jews that converted to the Hellenistic world, they didn't have a problem with the Romans, and the Romans didn't have a problem with them. But there was a huge segment of Jews that did not want to be Hellenized, and they did not want to convert to Greek speaking and Greek philosophy and Greek religions even. So these are the people that the Romans had a problem with,
Oh, I
and
see.
these are the people that Josephus worked for the Romans, whether he was Jew or not.
Understood. Thank you for that. Uh, so yeah, so you're looking into Josephus. You're still a believer, but you have many questions. You've been kicked out of the church.
Right. So right, I'm not a believer now, but in the story, when we get
Right.
back into the story,
Right. As we get
back in
back into your story.
2017, I was still a believer. I was trying to explain, the rapture, and realizing that the Bible says that Jesus was going to return before his apostles died, and they were going to see all the signs. Matthew 24, he says, "Assuredly, I tell you, this generation will not pass until all these things take place." And one of those things that he said was going to happen would be the visible appearance of Jesus in the clouds. The Son of Man would be visibly seen in the clouds. And he says, all these things will take place before this generation passes away. And what Christians do is they look at that and say, No, they mean our generation, 2,000 years in the future. And this is like an obvious, uh, uh, desperate excuse to explain why it doesn't mean what it actually says. Uh,
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that doesn't to me feel like enough justification. It like that's all they say is it just means us, or it just means future generations? What exactly are
well,
they saying?
well, exactly what they say today is there's a what they call the parable of the fig tree, and in the text, both this is mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It says, "Look at the fig tree or all the trees." He says, "When you see uh, the flowers blooming, you know that summer is near." And he says, "And so assuredly, I tell you, all these things will take place before this generation passes away." Now, obviously, it means the generation he's talking to, but Christians know they cannot interpret it that way. So they've had to come up with another explanation or excuse of how it doesn't mean that generation. So what they say is the generation that sees all these things, all these signs, that's the generation that Jesus is going to return in. And so this is how the
Ah,
Christians are looking at it today. And they're saying, oh my goodness, there's an earthquake. Oh my goodness, there's rumors of wars, which have always happened.
of
But
course.
Christians look at it and say, if there's an earthquake, if there's an eclipse, if there's a blood moon, which there's 4 blood moons every single year,
Yep.
and there's eclipses every single year, and there's wars and rumors of wars every single year, and there's earthquakes every year. But they think just because we see earthquakes and eclipses and blood moons and rumors of wars, they say, well, that means it's our generation because we have seen all these things. But they completely ignore the fact that every generation before us saw the exact same things.
And said the exact same things. I mean,
Right,
everybody
right,
thinks the end times is here.
right. And so that's another thing they do to interpret that passage wrong, because when they talk about the end of time and the end times, they're saying Jesus is going to come and destroy the whole planet. Even in the same context of Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, Jesus says, when you see these signs, flee Judea to the mountains. If you only have to flee Judea to go to the mountains to escape this great wrath that's coming, then it's obviously not the destruction of the whole world. It's only a destruction in Judea. And
Right.
so, as a preterist, when you read what the Bible says and you see that it's talking about first century events to first century audience, about a war that's coming to them, most Christians don't even know about Josephus or about the war between the Romans and the Jews. And it wasn't just one war, it was at least 3 major wars between the Romans and the Jews. Most Christians don't even know about it. And the reason is because they don't want you to know about it, because this is the reason they created Christianity. So, uh, and so this is the thought process that, I went out of mainstream Christianity into preterism, realizing that the return of Jesus was just talking about a war. And when I realized that even the book of Revelation, when you read the book of Revelation, and I wrote about this in my first book, It Is Finished. I gave an entire commentary on the book of Revelation, and I compare it to Josephus when it talks about, all the fish in the sea are going to die, the water's going to turn to blood, and there's going to be huge rocks on fire falling from heaven. Josephus talks about all the exact same things in his history of the War of the Jews. He talks about ships being wrecked and the waters being full of dead bodies and blood, and fish washing up on the shore, and all the grass and the vegetation being gone. So it's exactly so. The book of Revelation is just using Josephus to give this great apocalyptic ending, Armageddon battle, when it was actually talking about a real war that happened in 70 CE that resulted in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem.
Interesting. And do you think that the book of Revelation was either reading Josephus, or they were talking about the same thing? Was it inspired by Josephus? When was the book of Revelation written to the best of your
Well,
knowledge?
so uh, I've talked with Joseph Atwill, who wrote Caesar's Messiah. I've read his book, Caesar's Messiah. I came to most of my conclusions before I even knew about Joseph Atwill, but but I don't agree necessarily with everything Joseph Atwell says, because Joseph Atwell takes the position that essentially Josephus was writing the Bible with one hand and his War of the Jews with the left hand at the exact same time. You say, here's the prophecy and here's the fulfillment. I don't
Ah,
think I don't think the same person wrote it. I think it's too much for one person to write.
right.
Uh, and but but the more you study Josephus and the more you know about the Bible, as you read Josephus, you'll find so many parallels between Josephus and the Bible. So I believe the Bible was written after Josephus, after 70 CE. Josephus wrote about the histories of the Jews and the wars and around 70, 80, maybe into the 90s. I think he died somewhere in the 90s. But he was writing his historical version of events. And probably somebody else who was also working for the Flavian dynasty, but it would be somebody else, was just tasked with the agenda of creating a religious narrative that would use Josephus as a parallel. And then, so this is why they put Jesus back in time in the 30s, so that Jesus could be a prophet. They did not write, and all the scholars who have any integrity at all know that the Gospels were not written before 70 AD, before
Right. I've
70
definitely
CE.
heard that. So,
And so,
I was just going to say,
go
but
ahead.
you wrote a book as a believer before you got reached any of these conclusions, right?
Right. So I wrote my first book as a preterist, saying that Jesus actually returned in the war in 70 CE, and I explained it from the Bible. So I would still say the reason I haven't taken this book off the shelf is because I still think it is a really good book to read and study the Bible. Say, what does the Bible say about the return of Jesus? What does the book of Revelation mean? Uh, Even though the Bible is not true, it's not holy, it deserves no respect whatsoever, other than it's duped a bunch of people, millions of people, for many thousands of years, uh, which I don't respect that, but at least they were able to dupe people. um, it's still a good book to read, just to understand what the Bible says and what it means. uh, but the reason I had to write the second book, Jesus Demigod, is because I realized that even though what I said in the first book is what the Bible is teaching, the imminent return of Jesus in the first century when the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, excuse me, uh, I realized that Jesus was just a fictional character. And so that's why I wrote the second book, because I said, was Jesus even real? Let me look at the evidence for Jesus. And when you go look at the evidence for Jesus, the number one data point that all Christians are going to give is Josephus. And
Right.
I've been studying Josephus. And I'm like, oh, well, he doesn't talk about Jesus or Christianity anywhere except for this one passage. It's 125 words, and it's giving a glowing review of this supernatural man who resurrected from the dead. He doesn't talk about him before or after. He doesn't talk about Peter, Andrew, James, or John. He doesn't talk about the only other biblical character that he talks about is John the Baptist, and even the story of John the Baptist is similar but different than the biblical narrative.
Mm.
uh, and so when I found out that, and not only is that Testimonium Flavianum, that's the passage in Josephus, the Testimonium Flavianum, the 125 words. Uh, if you look, you'll find out that there are Greek words used in that text that Josephus never uses all the rest of his writings. And
Hmm.
an example word is poetus. So the Greek word poetus, uh, in the Testimonium Flavianum, it says Jesus, he was a supernatural man. He was a doer of wonderful deeds, and he taught the truth to those who love the truth. That word doer, that's poetus. And when Josephus used the word poetus, he used it as a noun or adjective or a noun like a poet. It's what it means, a poet, a writer, an artist. But when Eusebius in the 4th century, when Christianity became the Roman state religion,
Right.
Eusebius used the word poetus to mean a verb or a doer. And so, and Eusebius is the first person to ever cite or quote this testimonium Flavianum. There were many, and I wrote about this in Jesus Demigod. There were many Christians who talked about Josephus before Eusebius in the 4th century, but none of them mentioned that he talked about Jesus being the Messiah who resurrected from the dead. It wasn't until Eusebius. And so I believe Eusebius is the man who actually added that passage to
Yeah,
Josephus. And
that is
the
so
earliest,
damning.
yeah,
Christians talking about Josephus before the 4th century that failed to notice that Josephus said Jesus was the Christ.
right. And
That
that he
sounds like
resurrected
case
from the dead.
closed to me. I mean,
Right.
I don't even know how someone could argue with that.
And so the number one evidence that they have is actually evidence that Christians manipulated history just to add Jesus to it. That is the number one thing that all Christians are going to bring up. And they just accept that Josephus wrote it and they say, hey, this is a 1st century reference to Jesus. You say, really? Let's look at it and see. Because nobody quoted it until the 4th century. We don't have a manuscript of Josephus before the 11th century. The oldest manuscript we have of Josephus is the 11th century. So that gives them 1,000 years to change stuff. So,
Wow.
And then you look at the wording, you look at the purpose or motive for even saying this thing. And if you're talking about a superhuman who only does wonderful things and fulfills, another phrase is that he fulfilled 10,000 prophecies. So, talk about exaggeration and glowing reviews. Not even Christians. Christians only say he fulfilled like 300 prophecies. But Josephus said that he fulfilled 10,000 prophecies.
That's a lot of prophecies. I
And
feel like yeah. I feel like we're getting close to where I picked up with your narrative when I heard you speaking was that it in your latest book, and let's plug that book real quick, by the way, both your books. So the first one, can you give us the title one more time?
it is finished. Believe the unbelievable.
And your latest book?
Jesus Demigod, putting the Lord on trial.
There you go. And so this is where you really piqued my interest, is that you were saying that you believe that it was the Romans who pushed the myth of Jesus. And I'll let you pick it up from there. But that is where I was like, wow, I have not heard this before.
Well, once you see it, it's so abundantly clear. There's no possibility that anybody else could have done it. I know everybody wants to deny it. They want to push it away. Say no, the Romans persecuted Christianity. But as I was doing my research, I came across, because I was saying, look at all this people being crucified upside down, being skinned alive, thrown in boiling oil, and being pushed off the temples, and said, what? This is outrageous. You read Polycarp and the martyrdom of Polycarp. He was nailed to a stake and set on fire, but the fire couldn't hurt him, and it made a little sail like a sailboat. And so the executioner had to go stab him with a dagger, and then his blood put out the fire. Like, this is obvious, glorification of mythical deaths in order to, exonerate or deify their saints. And so, and I came across, I didn't read the book at the time. I've read it now. A book by Professor Candida Moss called "The Myth of Persecution." Because as I was looking at these examples of outrageous deaths of the apostles, these stories were not written contemporaneous with the events, or by any person who's witnessed any of the events. The same is true with the Bible. Not a single part of the Bible was written by anybody who was alive at the time in the 30s. So these things were written later by people who were not even eyewitnesses. Christians will argue that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are written by eyewitnesses, but there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever. They're all written in the third person. In fact, I came across something recently in Mark chapter 7, the first few verses, where the author of Mark says, the Jews washed their hands, because this is when, Jesus was saying, it doesn't matter, what goes in the mouth. It doesn't matter if you wash your hands or not. What goes into the mouth is not what defiles you, but what comes out. the Jews thought if you just ate pigs or unclean meat, that would defile you. But Jesus is saying, no, no, no. It doesn't matter what goes in your mouth, and you don't even have to wash your hands.
Yeah.
But in Mark 7, the author of Mark is saying they wash their hands and they do these things and they're ridiculous. So if you were a Jew, you wouldn't say those crazy Jews are they think they got to wash their hands. So it's obviously not even written by a Jew. It's not written in a Jewish language. It's written in Greek. It was written while the Romans ruled the world. The Romans spoke Greek. Now, Latin was the Roman language, but Greek was the common language in the Roman Empire. So, so everything about Christianity is Greek. It's written in Greek. It's about Greek philosophy. This idea of heaven and hell, that's a Greek idea. It's not a Hebrew idea. The Hebrews did not have this concept of heaven and hell. It's the Greeks that had that concept. So, and I was finding that even Matthew, Mark, Luke, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all say that Jesus ate the Passover meal, and then he went out to the Garden of Gethsemane after he ate the meal, and he identified Judas as his betrayer. And then he was arrested in the garden the same night that he just ate the Passover meal. Well, this means that the Jews had to call, the Sanhedrin together for an emergency midnight, trial of a man that they've been trying to trap and execute. But they would not hold an emergency trial on their high holy day, the day that they are supposed to be observing the Passover. They're supposed to have their belt around their waist and their staff in their hand and their sandals on their feet, getting ready to run away because God's about to rescue them from Egypt. That's what they're supposed to be doing. But instead of that, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're out there trying to hunt Jesus down in the Garden of Gethsemane so that they can hold an emergency trial on a high holy day when they're supposed to be doing other things. So this means that the people who wrote Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not understand that the Passover is an impossible day for them to be arresting Jesus. So John tried to correct that.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. What is the justification? How do people justify that?
So John says that the meal that they ate, Jesus's supposed last supper was I forget if it says 6 or 8 days. I think it's 6 days before Passover. He says it was 6 days before Passover, and he goes to Bethany at Mary and Martha's house, and he says they're eating just a common meal. This is not the Passover meal. They're close to Jerusalem because they're going to be in Jerusalem in 6 days when they actually observe the Passover. And John says that Jesus was arrested and tried and crucified and taken off the cross the day before Passover. So John is trying to correct Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but we all know that John was written later. So the people who wrote Matthew, Mark, and Luke were not Jews. They didn't understand Jewish tradition. They weren't speaking the Jewish language. They were speaking Greek. And they knew enough about the Jews to, at least talk about their holy day, the Passover, but they didn't understand that they would not hold a trial on Passover day. And they even say in the text, like Matthew, I forget what chapter it is, but right before they arrest Jesus, it says, "Let's not arrest him during the feast, lest there be a riot." So they understood, we need to arrest them before the Passover, but they don't. So when I'm reading through this stuff, when my eyes are open and every single line of every single page, there's a problem. When they say we can't arrest him during the Passover, and then in the same chapter they do, like, what's up? Like, you just arrested him after he ate the Passover meal. You just did what you said you didn't want to do. And so,
yeah,
it's just amazing.
Yeah, this gets to motivation. So, and this is, again, when I heard you speaking, this is what the stuff that I found so compelling, the motivation, why the Romans would want to create this myth of a Jewish Messiah. And why don't you get a little bit into that?
So, so the traditions in Christianity are pagan traditions that came from pagan gods that were in the Roman Empire. Mithra is one of the most significant ones. Serapis. He is pulling from Serapis and Dionysus and Asclepius and even Horus and Attis and all the pagan gods, the sun gods especially, the dying and rising gods. These are all pagan gods, and uh, so all they did was put a Jewish robe on top of their pagan gods and change the name. And so when you talk about the motive, like the nail in the coffin, because there is a clear motive for why the Romans would do this. The Romans were destroying the Jews in war, and the reason they were in war is because the Jews were trying to, maintain their independence. They were rebelling against Rome, and they wanted to be independent. They wanted to have Israel to themselves. They didn't want any bosses or governors from the Roman Empire, impeding in their business. In fact, even the Herod, the king of the Jews, was appointed by the Romans. The king of the Jews was not even a Jew. He was a Roman. Herod, now he was a Roman appointee. So he answered to the Romans. And so the Jews were revolting against the Roman Empire. They didn't like this oppression that they were receiving. They didn't want to pay their taxes to the Roman Empire. And so that's obviously a problem for the Romans. We can't have people thinking they don't need to pay us their taxes. And the Jews believed that their God would send a Messiah, not some supernatural man from the clouds, a literal general like David. That's why they say he'd be the son of David, because David was supposed to be the greatest king of all time of the Jews who defeated all his enemies. In fact, it even quotes Psalm 101, Psalm 110, verse 1, where it says, I will put your enemies, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. Well, in the Old Testament, Solomon says that's what God said about my daddy David. Solomon says, God told David to sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. And so they're quoting these, so-called things. They call them prophecies, but they were not a prophecy. It's not about Jesus coming to sit at the right hand of God. It was about David sitting at the right hand of God until he made his enemies his footstool. So they wanted to revive this, Davidic, messianic, repeat to history. This is the Jewish narrative, that they wanted God to send them a Davidic type general that would defeat their Romans, their enemies. But God failed them. God didn't send the Messiah. God didn't save them from their enemies. The Romans destroyed the Jews in war. And so when you have people like Caesar Titus, who actually was in charge of destroying the Jews, he goes into the temple and he finds the Jewish scriptures, and he's got all these Jews that are working for him. Titus's right-hand man was a Jew. He was a Hellenized Jew. There were many Hellenized Jews like Josephus and Philo of Alexandria who were already on the Roman side. They understood the Jewish culture and heritage and scriptures, but they were already Hellenized. They already Greek-speaking. They idolized Plato as their philosopher and Caesar as their lord. They just had a little understanding of the Jewish culture and the Jewish scriptures. And so I just imagine Titus saying, man, these Jews, these are some really diligent, committed people. What is their motivation for standing against Rome? They should know that Rome could easily defeat them. Why are they standing up and fighting against a losing battle against the Roman Empire? This is why the book of Revelation talks about the beast, it says, who can make war with the beast? Because Rome is the beast. And they knew they were the beast. They knew they were undefeatable and indestructible. And so they said, who are these Jews that are bowing up against us, the mighty beast? And so the Jews said, these guys are just motivated by their religion. They've got a written text that they believe in, that they believe that their God loves them more than anybody else and that he would never allow them to lose a war. And so they're fighting to the death, believing in their God. And the Titus says, well, shoot, we need people to fight for the Roman Empire like that. I have to pay my Roman soldiers, and I have to give them raises and all this before they will be motivated to fight. Why can't I just use a religion to get them to fight for me? He says, okay, well, we'll just create one. So they created Christianity. And Christianity, this is why Jesus says uh, repent or perish. And if unless you believe that I am He, you will die in your sins, and you must die for me. Jesus says, "Whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." This is what a Caesar would want his soldiers to believe: to fight to the death to defend your Lord.
Interesting. And the Jewish notion of the Messiah was was essentially different than what Jesus turned out to be, because Jesus, the Romans, the Messiah that the Jews were waiting for was somebody who would have fought the Romans. And the
Correct.
Jesus narrative that they created, as you're asserting, and I find just so fascinating, was somebody who did not fight the Romans, but rather said, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right?
Correct. And that's the whole part. And when you understand this perspective and you go back and read the New Testament, you will see it on every line. Every word that Jesus says, he's rebuking the Jews. He's telling them not to rebel, to be peaceful, and to submit to their rulers and to pay their taxes. And he's flipping over tables in the Jewish temple. So in Matthew chapter 23, he's calling them whitewashed tombs and blind guides of the blind and brood of vipers. He says all the blood that's ever been shed is going to fall on your head in this generation. So Jesus is just a Roman creation to threaten the Jews. But see, I don't think it didn't happen before the war. This was not written until after the war. So it's not like Jesus actually warned the Jews about the war that was coming. The war already happened and the Romans already destroyed the Jews. They were just trying to create a religion to replace this Jewish ideology that God loves the Israelites so much he will send them a Messiah to free them from the Roman Empire. He's like, we cannot have this religion in the Roman Empire that trains people to rebel against the Roman Empire. So they just created a new Jewish Messiah. And this new Jewish Messiah said, obey the Romans, submit to the Romans, slaves, obey your masters. And he says, even after you have done all that you're commanded to do, you are unworthy slaves doing only what is your duty to do. This is why Christians think the number one priority in life is to be a humble, obedient servant. They think that they are slaves of God. And when they submit to even the rulers of the land, they think they're submitting to God because they think God appointed, whether you're Republican or Democrat, whichever one is in office, they think God appointed that one. If they think it's the wrong one, they say, well, God's just trying to teach us a lesson and put the wrong one in there. But now we got a good one, so now God is pleased with us again.
Wow. And to your understanding of the Romans creating this narrative, how does this line up with the conversion of, say, Constantine and Christianity becoming the religion of Rome?
So at the time of Constantine, Constantine and the Roman Empire was going through great chaos at the time. And in fact, the Western Roman Empire is struggling so bad it's about to fall. And we're creating the Byzantine Empire, or the new Eastern Roman Empire from Constantinople, based on Constantine.
Right.
And so Constantine is seeing the chaos in the Roman Empire, and they've got all these different gods and all these different ideologies, and they can't control the minds of all these people. So they said, let's just consolidate into one religion so that it's easier to manage all these people. And so Constantine, and I learned this recently, Constantine is famous for having had a vision of Jesus who showed him the cross and said, if you will fight under this symbol, you will win many victories. Well, Constantine himself commissioned the building of an arch to his own honor. It's called the Arch of Constantine. It's right next to the Arch of Titus, right in front of the Roman Colosseum. And it shows depictions of the war where he came into power, where he was supposed to have had this vision to fight under Christian symbols. There's not a single Christian symbol on that entire arch. They're holding their shields, but there's no crosses on the shields. They're holding their little banners and the flags, but there's no crosses on the banners or the flags. And so this idea that he had a vision from God to fight under the symbol of the cross suspiciously doesn't appear on the monument that was built to commemorate this very event. So, Constantine was just consolidate. He used Christianity to consolidate the empire under one religion because it was easier to manage. It's not because he believed in it. In fact, this is why he was supposedly sending his mama back to Jerusalem to find the actual cross where Jesus was crucified, as if 300 and something years later, oh, here it is. Here's the cross Jesus was on. Like, how are you supposed to find the exact cross that Jesus was crucified on 300 years later? But they supposedly did.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It sounds like you're saying that somebody was using Christians to reach a nefarious, or at least a selfish end, and we've never seen that in history before. Although I will say the Crusaders, they believed that certain people had the power to determine these relics. Like if you found a sword, somehow you had some revelation that this was the sword that was
Right.
the Romans used to.
There's always a convenient vision. Somebody's, oh, I had a vision, and Jesus came to me and said, this is my actual cross, or this is the actual sword, or the spear that pierced Jesus. So whenever you say you had a vision,
Yeah,
nobody can disprove whether you had a vision or
of
not.
course.
So
The
it's
vision always
just the
serves
best
you.
way.
To this
Right.
day, prophets, and we talk about this on the show all the time. It's so convenient that the vision is always, people should give me all their money and let me sleep with their daughters. Strange how
Right.
that vision always seems to come along. So I just wanted to quickly ask about the Council of Nicaea then. That's when we know that the Bible was in the, at least in to some extent, the form that we understand it today was put together. Does that fall into this narrative as well? Was there an agenda therein, or were these already dyed in the wool Christians who were just trying to put the book together?
Well, so the Council of Nicaea, as I understand it, was in 325, which is under the reign of Constantine. So
Mhm.
Constantine actually sent out invitations. So Constantine is the guy who invited people to come together at Nicaea to establish Christian doctrine. They really weren't establishing the biblical canon at this time. They didn't have it established yet. It was still another 100 years before they established the biblical canon. The purpose of the Council of Nicaea was to get rid of this heretical idea that Jesus was just a regular man, because there were people saying Jesus was a regular man, the Arians, and they were saying this is unacceptable. Jesus was not a regular man. Let's get together. We'll tell people that Jesus was really a God, not just a God, but the God. And they didn't have the Trinity concept nailed down yet. The Trinity concept was established in 381 at the Council of Constantinople. 381. This is after Constantine's dead. Uh, and so 325, they're just trying to say let's make Jesus be God, and the other ecumenical councils that are coming from the next 200 or 300 years are all organized by Rome or the Roman Empire, which would be out of Constantine or Constantinople at this point, or the Byzantine Empire, and they're just establishing doctrine. These people that were living 3, 4, 500 years after the events are establishing the doctrine of Christianity. Now, everybody knows that Christianity is Roman at the 4th century. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows Constantine made it the Roman state religion. So there are some people that try to say, well, no, the real form of Christianity existed prior to Constantine, and Constantine just changed everything. But the Christianity that you and I know today, in all denominations and in all forms, they came out of the Roman Catholic Church. The Protestant Reformation
Mhm.
is a separation from the Roman Catholic Church. When I was in the Church of Christ, I rejected this and I denied it and said, no, the Church of Christ is the one true church that goes all the way back to Jesus. That's what I was
Yep.
told when I was in the Church
Yep.
of Christ. But the Church of Christ was actually started by a guy named, uh, is it Richard Campbell or something Campbell? Because somebody called me a Campbellite one day, and I'm like, what's a Campbellite? And I didn't even know who this guy was, named Campbell, that essentially started the Church of Christ.
Yeah, that seemed like just so obvious to me. And I remember the first time I said to, I think it might have been an evangelical Christian, like that they came out of the Roman Catholic Church because I grew up Catholic, and they, I think, correctly say that this is the church that was established at the time of Jesus. Clearly, not the time of Jesus, but it doesn't matter. The first church, and if you watch the evolution of it, was the Roman Catholic Church, and everything else branched off from it. And I was surprised to be screamed at, wrong, wrong, wrong. We
Right,
do not come from the Catholics. You come from the Catholics. You
right, they
clearly
do.
come from the Catholics.
They're just in denial. That's all.
Right. So,
And so one of my favorite quotes comes from a guy named Irenaeus in the 2nd century. And so this is when I wrote my book, Jesus Demigod, I wrote about the three primary church fathers, Clement of Rome, Irenaeus, and I, I forget who the other guy was. But Irenaeus is one of the guys that I was looking at. And one of my favorite quotes from there is Irenaeus says that all the churches around the world should take their direction from the most ancient church founded and organized by Peter and Paul in Rome. In the 2nd century, the Christian church father, Irenaeus, says that the most ancient church was founded and organized by Peter and Paul in Rome. Now, you want to tell me that this is not a Roman religion? The first church, the first church was not in Jerusalem. It wasn't in Israel. In fact, we don't even, there is no church, Christian church in Jerusalem. The Jews rejected Jesus. The Jews know that Jesus was not the Jewish Messiah. The Jews were being eradicated from the Roman Empire uh, and from Israel in war. So the Jews are dealing with their own existence and survival while the Christian church is being organized in Rome. The problem is they didn't make it the state religion in the 1st and 2nd century. They were just creating Roman wartime propaganda against the Jews, changing the ideology of what a Jewish Messiah is. Instead of a Jewish general, he was going to be a peaceful guy who says, submit to Rome. And they had no problem. They were polytheists. They would create a God whenever they wanted to, for whatever purpose they needed. And so they just created Jesus to control this ideology of the Jews that they need to rebel against the Roman Empire. But then as time progressed there was more and more chaos in the Roman Empire and starting to fall apart, Constantine just said, guys, we've got to get it together and consolidate under Christianity.
right. And so here's, I feel like I know the answer to this, but anytime I bring up the mythicist arguments to Christians, they are so quick to the majority of biblical scholars agree Jesus was a real person. And it seems to me that the obvious answer is, who are biblical scholars? Who would dedicate their life to studying the Bible? They started off as Christians, they continue to be Christians, and they are Christians to this day. How weird would it be if you were a Christian biblical scholar and you were like, yeah, and he never existed? That they
Well,
go into it with the notion of Jesus being real baked into the cake.
right, but I believe that's not really what they're saying. What they're saying, because everybody knows any Christian scholar is going to say Jesus was real. They're
Right.
saying that most secular scholars are saying that Jesus was a real person. And this is
Mhm.
a really important point to talk about because Bart Ehrman is probably the most famous scholar who says that he's not a Christian. He used to be a Christian. He left Christianity. So he says, I know Christianity is false. He mocks the Bible all the time. He points out, obvious flaws and errors and contradictions constantly. But he says Jesus existed, and his only justification for why he thinks Jesus existed is because the Bible says so. So he discredits the Bible, and then he uses the Bible to say, well, Jesus must have existed because so many people wrote about him. He will even tell you, he will even scream down your throat that there was no uh, person who was an eyewitness to Jesus who wrote about Jesus. Everybody who wrote about Jesus was writing about him many decades after Jesus was dead, and they were not eyewitnesses to the events. But yet he's taking their word. He just by default he says, well, if there's anything miraculous, the miracles didn't happen. But he said he assumes with no evidence whatsoever that the core foundation of the story is a true story but yet they added all the myth to it. That's the position he takes, and he has no justification for it. And so I would say there is a core foundation of truth to the story. But the truth is that the Romans were destroying the Jews in war, and they just created a new Jewish Messiah that fit their agenda. So that's the true story.
Right. And in arguing with Christians, I'll often there's two big things that they like to say. The one is that Paul says that he met James, the brother of Jesus. So that's, I guess, like whatever degrees of Kevin Bacon. So degrees of Jesus. This guy met the brother of Jesus, so Jesus must have been real. What's your take on that? I mean, what's your take on Paul in general?
Well, so I asked Candida Moss one day. She was on TikTok, and I was in her live, and I asked her a question in the comment section. I wasn't up in the panel with her, but I said, "Are you aware of any references to Paul as a historical character in any historical writing?" And she almost, I could see her get blood red, flushed in the face, and say, "No, but that doesn't mean he didn't exist." So, um, so I think I like Candida Moss. I think she has, in fact, in her book, the Myth of Persecution, she has a something at the end of the book that says she was afraid to even publish her book because she was afraid she would, receive too much criticism or even lose her job. And somebody assured her that if she would just say what she thinks is right, that she wouldn't get fired. You see, when you talk about why do scholars say Jesus existed, because most scholars have, well, all scholars, this is how they make a living. So they make a living off of what they say about the Bible. And a lot of them are working at religious institutions. Even if, like Bart Ehrman teaches biblical history at UNC or something like that. And, he can say that the Bible is full of errors and contradictions, but for whatever reason, he can't say that Jesus didn't exist, and he can't provide any good evidence that Jesus did exist. But scholars are just in a precarious position. They've got to go where it will not impact their survival with whatever they say, because people like Richard Carrier, who takes the mythicist position, he will tell you when he started taking the position that Jesus wasn't a real person, he essentially got blackballed and pushed out of the scholarly community. So he has to survive now based on the things that he writes and the speaking engagements for people that don't have the agenda that you have to say Jesus existed. So there is you've got a huge world religion with 2 billion people that do not want to hear that Jesus was not a real person, that it's mythology, that it's all made up. Especially, I mean, they've gotten the special hatred to me saying that the Romans created it when it's abundantly clear that they did. Uh, People are just preserving their bottom line and their ideology. Uh, and if you have any debate, because I watched when I was trying to figure this stuff out, I watched Bart Ehrman debate Richard Price. Wait, no, it's not Richard Price, Robert Price. Bart Ehrman and Robert Price debated, and I think it's still on YouTube now, the existence of Jesus. And at the time, I was still thinking Jesus was real, but I was like, my goodness, Bart doesn't have any good arguments. And so as I continued to study and look for good arguments, and I listened to many different scholars, Robin Faith Walsh and Candida Moss and Richard Carrier and all these guys, trying to watching Myth Vision on YouTube. He's interviewing all these people and asking them if Jesus was real. And whenever you ask a scholar if Jesus was real, they all act the same way. The ones that think Jesus was real, they do like Candida Moss did. They get blood, flush red in the face, and they start stuttering and hum-hawing around and saying, just too many people wrote about him. There must have been some kernel of truth in the story. And they don't understand that the kernel of truth is just a war and that they needed to change the idea of a Jewish Messiah. They're just assuming that there must have been a kernel to truth to the character of Jesus. Uh, but when you read Josephus, I mean, uh, in fact, in Matthew chapter 16, verse 27 and 28, Jesus says, "The Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels to reward everyone according to their works. And assuredly, I tell you, some of you standing here will not taste death until you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." I've always wondered as a Christian why Jesus called himself the Son of Man. The Son of Man. Jesus is supposed to be the Son of God, not the Son of Man. But Jesus called himself the Son of Man more than he called himself the Son of God. He rarely called himself the Son of God. He called himself the Son of Man most of the time. And Jesus associated his second coming with the destruction of the temple in 70 CE in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And so, which Son of Man actually came in the glory of his Father with his angels to reward the Jews according to their rebellious works in 70 CE when the temple was destroyed? It was the son of Caesar, the son of Vespasian, whose name was Titus. Titus came back to Jerusalem because Vespasian started the war. Vespasian under Nero, Vespasian was the general, Nero was the Caesar. Vespasian started the war in 66. Then he went to take over the empire in 69. And he sent his son in the glory of the Father with his angels, the Roman army, to reward the Jews for their rebellion. And so the Jesus character is based off of Caesar Titus. He's the Son of Man. He's the guy that returns in the glory of the Father when the temple is destroyed. So it's a hidden Roman cult. It's a secret way to worship Caesar as God without overtly saying that you're worshiping Caesar Titus and Caesar Vespasian, the Flavian dynasty.
Wow. So interesting. So I guess my final question to you is, do you see this narrative growing? Do you see it catching fire, so to speak? I've seen you speak. I've seen people listening to you. Is this falling on deaf ears? Obviously, everything falls on the deaf ears of the Christians.
Right.
But even in the secular community, do you think that this narrative, which seems to me like you're bringing the receipts, you have so much good evidence, do you see this being possibly the narrative that takes us into the 21st century?
I definitely do. And, I think I'm over half dead, but I believe in the second half of my life, I'm going to see a drastic change in the world because I'm motivated to make it happen. So I believe I have the truth, I have the evidence, and you can know Christianity's false simply by quoting any one of a number of verses where Jesus says, whoever believes in me can heal the sick. Well, you can't heal the sick. No Christian can go to the hospital and heal the sick. You know it's false with that point alone, but I could point to 1,000 other verses to make the same, disproof of Christianity. We know it's not true. The only issue is who created the lies and why. And I've got the answers to those. Who created it and why? And so I've got the whole story. I know it's false. I know who told it and why they told it. And even people that are atheists fight with me and say there's no way I'm right, but yet they don't. In fact, I just had a debate with a preterist Christian recently, and as well as Wi-Fi Gospel, uh, and they don't have any alternatives. They don't have another suggestion. They don't have a suggestion as to who did it or why. They say, well, it just appeared out of nowhere for no apparent reason, and then the Roman Empire just said, "Yeah, this looks cool. We'll just do this." That's not what happened.
Yeah. It's so funny because you said, because I have the truth, which is something I hear from Christians all the time. I have the truth. And then you ask them to bring the receipts, to bring the evidence for the truth, and they've got nothing. It's a feeling they have in their heart,
Right.
and that's about it. And when Jeff for Truth says, I have the truth, he brings the receipts. So informative, so interesting. And I have to say, I think this is the record. This is the episode of Dogma Debate where I spoke the least, because sometimes you just shut up and learn. And that's what I did in this episode. Jeff, phenomenal having you on the show. Thank you so much. I really feel like you opened my mind and my eyes to some really interesting information.
Well, I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm glad you reached out to me, and I hope that we reach a lot of other people, because this is information that needs to be known.
Yeah, and to all the listeners, please reach out to Jeff. He's at Jeff for Truth. He's on TikTok and all social media. Would you say?
Primarily YouTube and TikTok, which TikTok is supposed to go away pretty soon. So,
Yeah.
uh, YouTube definitely is not going away. So Jeff for Truth there, and I've got a link tree. So I believe Linktree. If you just Google Linktree Jeff for Truth, I think you can find me. I used to call myself Bible Jeff when I first created the Linktree. I called myself Bible Jeff. So, if you can't find it under Jeff for Truth on Linktree, Linktree Bible Jeff might get you there as well.
Sounds great. Jeff, thanks for coming on Dogma Debate.
Thank you.